The bullet hit the water trough 3 inches from Jonas Ford's ear and sent a geyser of splinters and murky water spraying across the side of his face. He pressed his back harder against the rotting wood, sucking in a breath that tasted of gunpowder and fear, and took stock of what he had. One Colt single-action army revolver, 4 bullets remaining, 2 dead deputies behind him, men he had ridden with for 3 years, men whose wives would be receiving letters before the week was out. And somewhere in the darkness of the livery stable across the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, 7 heavily armed men who had planned this ambush with the kind of precision that told Jonas someone had betrayed him, someone close, someone who had known every detail of tonight's operation. The Harmon gang had ridden into Caldwell not as raiders, not as drifters, but as a coordinated military unit. They had taken the telegraph office first, cutting Caldwell off from any possibility of calling for help from the U.S. Marshal's office in Wichita. They had barricaded the hotel with the town's civilians inside, using those 23 souls as a silent guarantee that Jonas would not fire indiscriminately. They had then systematically eliminated his deputies in a sequence so precise it could only have been designed by someone who knew exactly where each man would be standing at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in October of 1882. Jonas Ford was pinned down without options. Every angle of escape was covered. The gap between the general store and the barber's shop was visible from the livery. The alley behind the jail was where they had killed Deputy Chester Rowe not 20 minutes ago, a trap so neatly sprung that Chester had never even cleared his holster. The rooftop above Jonas was exposed to the shooter positioned in the grain warehouse window, a man whose rifle accuracy had already demonstrated itself on Deputy Frank Aldis at a range of 200 yards. 4 bullets, 7 men, a dark street, no help coming. And then, from somewhere behind the darkness of the narrow gap between the post office and the millinery shop, a sound reached Jonas that made absolutely no sense. It was the sound of breaking glass, sharp and deliberate, followed by the unmistakable whoosh of something catching fire. Not an explosion, not a gunshot, a controlled, purposeful fire. A lantern, thrown with extraordinary precision, had sailed through the open door of the grain warehouse and landed on the dry straw packed against the eastern wall. The man in that window disappeared from his position in a sudden, panicked scramble, and Jonas heard shouting in the dark, the shouting of men whose carefully constructed plan had just encountered something they had not anticipated. Chaos, seated by a single, perfectly thrown lantern. Jonas did not waste the moment. He moved. He had been the Sheriff of Caldwell for 4 years, appointed in the spring of 1878 when the cattle drives were at their wildest peak and Caldwell's reputation, as the roughest port of entry on the Kishom Trail, meant that no man of questionable nerve would survive a month in the Star. Jonas had survived 4 years because he was smart, because he was fast, and because he had never in his life panicked in a moment of crisis. But he had never been given a moment of crisis by a woman before, and as he sprinted low across the dirt street in the direction of the millinery shop, he had to admit that whoever had thrown that lantern had just saved his life. He pressed into the shadow of the millinery doorway and heard movement to his left. He spun, raising his Colt, and found himself pointing the barrel directly at the face of Matilda Hurst. She was holding 2 more lanterns in her left hand, a leather satchel thrown over her right shoulder, and she was looking at him with the calm, assessing expression of a woman who had not remotely expected to be frightened by his reflexes. She was wearing dark clothes, a practical wool riding skirt and a fitted coat the color of charcoal, and her dark brown hair was pulled back severely from a face that was striking in its intelligence, angular and direct, with eyes that caught the distant glow of the burning grain warehouse, and reflected something that looked far too much like calculation to be anything other than deliberate strategy. "Sheriff," she said quietly, not a greeting, a confirmation. "Who the hell are you?" Jonas demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who just saved your life," she said. which means you owe me 4 minutes of listening without arguing. After that, you can be as stubborn as you appear to be." Jonas stared at her. In the background, the Harmon gang was shouting at each other across the street, two men visible now running toward the warehouse with bucket lines that would do them no good whatsoever given the dry conditions of an October Kansas night. "Talk," he said. Her name was Matilda Hurst, and she had arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks before the ambush, and Jonas Ford had noticed her almost immediately, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she was wrong. She was wrong for Caldwell in the way that a perfectly calibrated instrument is wrong in a room full of rough tools. She had taken a room at the Abilene House, which was Caldwell's finest boarding house and operated by a widow named Mrs. Garrett, and she had paid 3 months in advance in coin that was genuine and precisely counted. She had told Mrs. Garrett she was a land surveyor's assistant, which had prompted Mrs. Garrett to tell Jonas, which had prompted Jonas to look into it, which had revealed nothing alarming. Women sometimes worked in frontier professional capacities, particularly widows or educated women of reduced circumstances, who had found that the frontier cared less about social convention than eastern cities did, as long as you could do the work. What had kept nagging at Jonas was not her occupation but her behavior. She rose before dawn every morning and returned after dark every evening. She carried a leather case that clanked softly with instruments. She asked questions in the general store about property boundaries and water rights and the locations of specific ranches that were so precise and so knowledgeable that old Hector Blaine, who had homesteaded here since 1869, had told Jonas she knew more about survey law than most lawyers he had met. Jonas had spoken to her exactly twice before the night of the ambush. The first time had been on the boardwalk outside the post office, 8 days after her arrival, when he had tipped his hat and offered the standard sheriff's welcome that he extended to all newcomers, keeping his tone measured and professional, because he had learned in 4 years that people revealed more when they felt respected than when they felt interrogated. She had looked at him with those assessing eyes and said, "You want to know what I am doing here, Sheriff. I appreciate that you are being polite about it. I am investigating land fraud, and I cannot tell you the details yet because I do not know who in this town I can trust." He had been so surprised by the directness that he had not managed a response before she had nodded pleasantly and walked away. The second time had been 5 days later, in the early evening, when he had seen her crouched at the edge of the creek that ran behind the livery stable, and she had been using a transit instrument with the focused expertise of someone who had done it 1,000 times. A transit was a surveying tool, a precisely engineered telescope mounted on a calibrated base that allowed the measurement of horizontal and vertical angles with great accuracy. Jonas knew what it was because his father had been a civil engineer before the war, one of the men who had helped lay early railroad grades in Ohio, and Jonas had grown up watching the transit the way other boys grew up watching their fathers shoe horses. He had crouched beside her and said nothing, watching her work. After several minutes, she had said without looking up from the eyepiece, "The Harmon family has been filing fraudulent land surveys with the county recorder in Wellington for 2 years. They have claimed ownership of 6,000 acres of creek-fed grazing land that belongs either to homesteaders or to the public domain. I have now documented 18 separate boundary violations with instruments that will stand up in any federal court." Jonas had said, "The Harmons," she had said, "Yes, Edgar Harmon and his brother Clyde, and whoever in this county helped them file the false surveys, because someone with access to the recorder's office did." Jonas had gone very still, because what Matilda Hurst had just described was the kind of corruption that did not stay at the level of paperwork for long. Men who stole land with fraudulent surveys did not stop when they were challenged. They escalated. He had looked at her then, really looked at her, and asked, "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" "Since I was 19, she had said, finally taking her eye from the transit and looking at him directly. My father was the finest survey instructor in Illinois. He taught me everything, and when he died, I discovered his surveying instruments were the only inheritance he had left me, because the land he had worked his whole life to own had been stolen from him by exactly the kind of fraudulent boundary manipulation the Harmons are using here. I have made it my profession to find these situations and document them before they can be buried. She was 28 years old. She had been doing this for 9 years alone on the frontier. Jonas had asked, "Are you in danger?" She had looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to annoyance he had yet seen on her composed face and said, "I am always in danger, Sheriff. That is the cost of doing work that matters." He had gone back to his office that evening and sat for a long time in his chair thinking about her. He had been sheriff for 4 years. He had handled cattle drive disputes and horse thieves, and the occasional violent drunk, and one truly ugly murder case involving a dispute over a poker debt. He had never handled organized land fraud backed by a gang of armed men. He had sent a telegram to the U.S. Marshal's office in Wichita that same evening, requesting assistance and outlining what Matilda had told him. The marshal's office had responded that they would send a deputy within the week. The deputy had never arrived. Instead, 6 days after Jonas sent that telegram, the Harmon gang had ridden into Caldwell. Now, pressed into the shadow of the millinery doorway with the grain warehouse burning across the street and 4 bullets in his Colt, Jonas Ford listened to Matilda Hurst explain the plan she had already set in motion, and the shock of what she had prepared in the hours before the ambush struck him like a physical blow. "I knew they were coming tonight," she said quietly, keeping her eyes moving between the street and his face with an alertness that reminded him of a hawk watching 2 horizons simultaneously. "3 days ago, I found boot tracks at the Eastern Creek crossing that were made by horses wearing shoes from a particular farrier in Medicine Lodge. I identified them by the nail pattern, a distinctive asymmetry in the left front of one horse. I tracked that horse's rider to a meeting at the old Calder homestead north of town, and I watched that meeting through a rifle scope from 500 yards. Edgar Harmon was there. So was your deputy, Walt Sims." Jonas felt the name land like a fist in his chest. Walt Sims, 7 years on the force. Walt Sims, who had known the positions of every deputy tonight because Jonas had briefed them all at the morning roll call. "Walt Sims is the traitor," he said flatly. "Was," Matilda said. "He rode south with the Harmon advance party 2 days ago. I believe they paid him enough to disappear. He will not be coming back." "So you knew," Jonas said, and the word came out harder than he intended, edged with something that was not quite anger at her but was certainly anger. "You knew for 3 days and you did not tell me." She met his gaze without flinching. "I was not certain which of your deputies was compromised until the afternoon of today, when I confirmed it was only Sims and not Aldous or Rowe. I am sorry I did not get to you in time to save them. That is something I will carry for the rest of my life." The genuine weight in her voice stopped his anger before it could build into something unfair. She had been working a 3-day intelligence operation alone, without resources, without backup, and she had gotten further than he had with a full sheriff's office and a territorial telegraph line. "What did you set up?" he asked. She set one of the lanterns down carefully and opened the leather satchel. Inside, organized with the methodical precision of someone who had thought through every contingency, were the materials of a diversion that had been constructed with the logic of a military campaign. 3 more prepared lanterns with extended slow-burning wicks, a coil of rope, a set of signal mirrors the size of his palm, a hand-drawn map of Caldwell Street grid with positions marked in precise notations that used surveyors' compass bearings rather than simple directions. "I have been placing materials in 7 locations around town for the past 48 hours, she said. "The grain warehouse fire is the opening move. It will draw 3 of their 7 men because Edgar Harmon cannot afford to let that building burn completely. It contains the original fraudulent survey documents he brought with him to finalize the land transfer at tomorrow's county session. He does not know that I already have complete duplicate measurements and certified copies of the genuine surveys, but he will try to save those documents before anything else. Jonas stared at her. You knew what was in the warehouse. I have been watching this gang for 11 days, Sheriff Ford. I know where they sleep, what they eat, what they fear, and what they cannot afford to lose. She pointed to the map. The 3 men who go to the warehouse will encounter a second fire in the attached hay store, which I set to ignite 15 minutes after the first. They will be trapped in a bucket line for 30 minutes minimum. That leaves 4 men on the street. And the hotel hostages, Jonas said. The hotel hostages are safe for precisely as long as Edgar Harmon needs them to be, which is until he believes he has killed you. He will not harm them while he thinks he still needs them as insurance. So we have a window. She looked at the map. 2 of the remaining 4 men are positioned at the north and south ends of Main Street. I have placed a noise-making device at each position, a system of tripwires connected to suspended tin cans filled with gravel. When those tripwires are activated, each man will turn to investigate the noise behind him. That gives us 4 to 6 seconds of distraction per man. 4 to 6 seconds, Jonas repeated. Which is sufficient time for you to close 30 feet of distance and disarm a man if you are as fast as your reputation suggests, she said, with a look that was assessing rather than flattering. He almost smiled despite himself. And the other 2? The other 2 are inside the saloon, which faces south. They are watching the back exit of the hotel through the saloon windows. I need you to trust me on those 2. What does trust you mean, exactly? She reached into the satchel and produced a small device that Jonas recognized after a moment as a signal mirror. A polished piece of tin angled with a notched sighting hole. The kind of instrument that the Army Signal Corps had been developing for communication across distances that made shouting impossible. It was a frontier adaptation of a heliograph, and in the hands of someone who knew Morse code, it could transmit messages at the speed of reflected sunlight. There is a man on the roof of the hotel, Matilda said. He has been up there for 6 hours. His name is Thomas Reed, and he is a rancher whose property the Harmon gang claimed in a fraudulent survey 8 months ago. He lost his cattle to impoundment when the false title was filed. He has been waiting for the chance to do something about it, and I gave him that chance when I recruited him yesterday. Jonas felt the ground shifting under a kind of respect he was not accustomed to experiencing. She had, in 36 hours, assembled an intelligence operation, recruited a civilian asset, prepared a series of coordinated diversions, and positioned herself in the field ready to execute the plan in real time. She had done all of this alone with surveying instruments and a surveyor's methodical discipline applied to human geography instead of physical terrain. You mapped them, he said slowly. The way you would map a survey. You measured their positions, their movement patterns, their sight lines. For the first time, something in her composed expression softened just fractionally, a warmth that arrived and was instantly contained, like a lamp that someone cupped their hand around. Yes, she said simply. That is exactly what I did. The crash of a second explosion from the direction of the warehouse confirmed that the hay store fire had ignited on schedule. The shouting across the street intensified. We need to move now, Matilda said, her voice returning to its operational efficiency. She picked up the lanterns. The south end man first, then north. I will run the signal to Thomas on the hotel roof from the east alley. When he sees my signal, he drops a rope to the hotel's back window, and 2 families can get their children out before the Harmon men inside realize anything has changed. And Edgar Harmon himself? Jonas asked. She paused, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that was not calculation, but was the closer and more personal emotion of someone with skin in the outcome. Edgar Harmon is in the sheriff's office, she said. Jonas went cold. My office. He went in through the back window 20 minutes before his men started shooting. He is going through your desk, your filing cabinet, your evidence locker. He is looking for my survey documentation because someone told him I had given it to you." She met his eyes, which I had not as of tonight, but he does not know that. And by the time he realizes the documents are not there, the situation on the street will have changed significantly. He is alone in my office. He is alone in your office with a bottle of your whiskey, which I observed him locating in your second desk drawer. Something very close to fury moved through Jonas, swift and hot, and then something else replaced it, the controlled focus that 4 years of frontier law enforcement had burned into his character like a brand. He looked at Matilda Hurst, at the calm precision of her preparation, at the operational map in her hand, at the lanterns ready in their perfect sequence, and he made a decision. "South man first," he said. "Let us move." They moved through Caldwell's back alleys like water moving through channels, swift and silent, and shaped perfectly to the available space. Jonas had walked these alleys in the dark 100 times and knew every loose board and every gap in every fence, and Matilda moved behind him with a quiet precision that told him she had walked them too, probably multiple times, mapping them. The South End man was positioned at the corner of Main and Commerce, leaning against the exterior of the harness shop with a rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. He was watching the trough where Jonas had sheltered earlier, expecting the sheriff to still be there, expecting the siege to continue on its original terms. He had not been informed that the terms had changed. From the darkness of the alley behind the harness shop, Jonas heard the faint, precise metallic sound of Matilda's trip wire activating, a cascade of tin can noise from the direction of the feed store behind the gunman, exactly as she had predicted. The man's head snapped toward the sound, his rifle lifting. Jonas was already moving. 30 feet of dirt alley at a sprint, the soft ground absorbing his footsteps, closing the distance in 4 seconds, and the man was still turning back when Jonas hit him with a shoulder tackle that took them both to the ground. No shots fired. A swift, clean blow to the jaw that put the man into unconsciousness. Jonas pulled the man's belt free and used it to secure his wrists, then took the rifle and 3 additional shells from the man's coat pocket. He looked back toward the alley. Matilda was already gone, moving toward the north position. He followed her at a run, keeping to the shadows, and arrived at the north end of Main just in time to see her second trip wire activate. The gravel-filled cans crashing together in the dark behind the barber shop, and the north man turned, and Jonas was already there. This one was faster. He got his arm up before Jonas reached him, and they struggled for 3 seconds in near silence, the kind of fierce, contained violence that makes no sound because both men are too focused for noise. Jonas was stronger and he used it, twisting the man's gun arm outward until the shoulder gave with a sound that ended the struggle, and the man went down clutching his arm, conscious but incapacitated. 2 down, 2 in the saloon. Edgar Harmon in the office. Jonas looked toward the east alley and saw the brief, brilliant flash of reflected moonlight from Matilda's signal mirror, 3 quick pulses and a long one, aimed at a precise angle toward the hotel rooftop. A pause. Then 2 pulses back from somewhere above, barely visible, a sliver of light from a position on the roof where Thomas Reed had been waiting for 6 hours. The plan was running. Jonas moved to the saloon's south wall and positioned himself at the window. Through the glass, which was thick and imperfect in the way of frontier glass that had been shipped from St. Louis and was lucky to have arrived intact, he could see 2 men at the far end of the bar. Both were watching the hotel's back exit through the saloon's south-facing door, which stood open. Both were armed and alert, but they were watching a single, fixed point. They were not watching the saloon's front door. Matilda appeared beside Jonas at the window, having moved around the building's exterior with a speed that continued to surprise him, and she assessed the interior for approximately 4 seconds with the rapid, comprehensive eye of a woman who had been measuring distances and angles for 9 years. She reached into her satchel and produced a small glass bottle stoppered with a cork, and inside the bottle was a dark liquid. She held it up so he could see it in the moonlight, and he recognized it as lamp oil mixed with something granular. And she pointed to the saloon's chimney pipe, and then to the bottle, and then mimed a throwing motion toward the chimney's exterior vent hood. He understood in an instant. The chimney would draw the smell down into the saloon, not enough to start a fire, enough to fill the room with the sudden, sharp smell of burning, enough to make two men who were already nervous about the fire at the warehouse spin toward the source, toward the back of the room and the kitchen area where the chimney pipe ran. She threw the bottle with an accuracy that he would later describe to himself as the most impressive physical act he had ever witnessed in 4 years of frontier law enforcement. It was not a strong throw. It did not need to be. It was a precise throw, angled to clip the outer edge of the vent hood, break on impact, and spray its contents across the hot metal surface of the chimney pipe exterior. The effect was immediate, a sudden sharp crackle of burning oil and a bloom of dark, acrid smoke that poured through the vent into the chimney and down into the saloon's kitchen space. Both men inside spun toward the kitchen. Jonas went through the front door. It was over in less time than it takes to describe. The first man caught the barrel of the rifle Jonas had taken from the south end guard across the side of his head. The second man had time to raise his weapon, but not to aim it before Jonas was inside his reach, and the fight became immediate and physical, and one-sided in Jonas's favor by a margin that came down to strength and desperation, and the cold, clarifying knowledge that there were 23 civilians in the hotel next door who needed this done now. 2 more men down, secured with their own belts and tied to the bar with the coil of rope. Matilda passed through the saloon door 30 seconds after the fight ended. She came inside and stood in the lamplight of the saloon's interior and looked at the 2 secured men with an expression of satisfied assessment, the expression of someone checking items against a list. "The warehouse men will be occupied for another 12 to 15 minutes, she said. "Thomas Reed has the hotel families moving to the upper floor exit now. That leaves Edgar Harmon." She looked at Jonas, and something in her eyes asked a question she did not put into words. "My office," Jonas said. "I know that building better than anyone alive." He did. He had lived in Caldwell for 4 years. He had repaired the floorboards of the sheriff's office himself twice. He knew which board near the back window creaked, and which door hinge had developed a squeak that he had been meaning to oil since August. He knew that the evidence locker had a secondary latch that required lifting the handle at a precise angle, and he knew that Edgar Harmon, searching for documents in an unfamiliar office in the dark, would not find the secondary latch and would spend considerable time trying to force a lock that would not open by force. He also knew that Edgar Harmon would hear the front door if anyone came through it. But he would not hear the trapdoor in the floor of the back storeroom, the trapdoor that Jonas had cut himself 3 years ago as a private emergency exit, the trapdoor that opened from below via a drainage channel that ran under the building, a channel Matilda could not possibly have known about because Jonas had told no one, not even his deputies. He told Matilda now, quickly, in a low voice, because the plan required that she know. She listened to the description of the drainage channel and the trapdoor dimensions and the distance from the trapdoor to the main office door, and when he finished she nodded once crisply and said, "How long from the time you enter the channel to the time you are in position at the trapdoor?" 90 seconds at a walk, 60 at a run." "Run," she said. "I will give you your 60 seconds and then I will walk through the front door of your office." He stared at her. "You will walk through the front door." "Edgar Harmon is not expecting a woman," she said evenly. "He will have a single, surprised moment of hesitation when he sees me, because every piece of his experience and his assumptions tells him that a woman walking through that door is not a threat. That hesitation is approximately 2 seconds long. Add it to the time it takes him to stand from a seated position, which given the whiskey in your desk I estimate at approximately 1 additional second, and you have 3 seconds to come through that trapdoor and across the floor." Jonas looked at her for a long moment, standing in the saloon lamplight with 2 secured outlaws on the floor behind her, and the sound of the burning warehouse creating a distant orange glow through the window glass. And he felt something happen inside him that he had not felt in a very long time. Something that was not professional respect or tactical admiration, but was something deeper and more fundamental. The recognition of a mind and a character that matched and in certain specific ways exceeded his own. He had been shocked by capable women before. He had not been shocked by this. He had been humbled. 3 seconds, he said. Yes, she said. Do not waste them. He did not. The drainage channel was cold and smelled of earth and old wood, and Jonas moved through it on his hands and knees at a speed that he estimated would have impressed him if he had been watching from outside. He counted his seconds by internal rhythm, the way he had learned to do in moments when counting out loud would get him killed, and at 58 seconds, he was beneath the trapdoor with his hand on the handle. He heard the front door of his office open. He heard Edgar Harmon's voice, sharp with surprise, say, "The hell are you?" He heard Matilda's voice, completely steady, say, "Good evening, Mr. Harmon. I am the woman who has spent the last 11 days documenting every fraudulent land survey you have ever filed in Sumner County." 1 second. He heard the scrape of a chair as Harmon stood. 2 seconds. He heard Harmon say, "You are the one who has been nosing around my Jonas came through the trapdoor." The distance from the trapdoor to Edgar Harmon was 14 feet, and Jonas covered it in the 3rd second, and the fight that followed was brief and definitive. Edgar Harmon was a man who managed violence rather than performing it, a man who organized others to do the dangerous work, while he managed the paperwork and the corruption and the strategic positioning. He was not soft, but he was not prepared for a sheriff who had covered 14 feet in 1 second and had the focused intensity of a man who had watched 2 deputies die tonight because of this man's decisions. Edgar Harmon went down. He did not get up for a considerable time. Jonas stood over him in the lamplight of his own office, breathing hard, and looked across the room at Matilda Hurst, who was standing exactly where she had been standing when Harmon had looked at her, in the center of the room with her hands at her sides and her satchel over her shoulder and an expression on her face that was composed and quietly triumphant, and for the first time in his experience of her, genuinely open. "You moved fast," she said. "You were right about 3 seconds," he said. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and in the silence between them, with Edgar Harmon unconscious on the floor and the distant sound of the grain warehouse burning, and the certain knowledge that by morning this would all be over, something shifted between them that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy or professional respect. It had to do with the way she was looking at him, which was not the way she looked at a situation to be solved. It was the way she looked at something she was not sure she was permitted to want. He recognized it because he was looking at her the same way. "The warehouse men," he said, returning to the operational sequence with an effort that cost him something. 12 minutes, she said. "We have time." They took Edgar Harmon's wrists and secured them with the last length of rope from the satchel, and Jonas sent Matilda to watch the front while he moved through the office to the back door, stepping outside to check the perimeter. The warehouse fire had settled into a steady, controlled burn, the attached hay store having collapsed inward in a way that actually contained the fire rather than spreading it, which Jonas suspected was another detail Matilda had calculated when she chose her ignition point. The 3 warehouse men were silhouetted against the glow, still working the bucket line, still trying to save a building that was beyond saving. They did not know their boss was unconscious in the sheriff's office. They did not know their colleagues were secured in the saloon. They did not know that the moment Jonas had enough light to work by, they were surrounded. That moment came 20 minutes later, as the fire burned lower, and the false dawn of its dying glow still illuminated the street clearly enough for accurate work. Jonas came out of the front of his office with Edgar Harmon, wrists bound and walking with the gait of a man who was going to have a significant headache for several days, and he stood in the middle of the main street of Caldwell and said, in the carrying voice that 4 years of frontier law enforcement had given him, "Harmon gang, listen. Your boss is in custody. Your men on the street are in custody. The warehouse fire was a diversion and it worked. Set your weapons down or I shoot Edgar Harmon where he stands. He would not have done it, but Edgar Harmon did not know that. And more relevantly, Edgar Harmon's 3 warehouse men, who had just spent 40 minutes losing a bucket line battle with a fire in the dark, who had watched their carefully constructed plan collapse sequentially from the warehouse backward with no explanation available to them, were tired and disoriented and suddenly faced with their employer in physical custody in the middle of a street lit by their own burning building. They set their weapons down. Thomas Reed, from the hotel rooftop, covered the disarmament with a rifle borrowed from a grateful homesteader, whose family had been evacuated through the back exit 40 minutes prior. By the time the sun rose over the Kansas plains on the morning of October the 14th, 1882, all 7 members of the Harmon gang were secured in the Caldwell jail. The hotel civilians were safe in their rooms. The documentary evidence of 6 months of fraudulent land surveying was in Jonas's evidence locker, where Edgar Harmon had been unable to find it because of the secondary latch. And Matilda Hurst was sitting on the front step of the sheriff's office drinking coffee from a tin cup that Jonas had made on the office stove, because it was the only thing he could think to do for her that felt adequate. He sat down beside her, not at a professional distance, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You saved this town," he said. She looked at the street, the ordinary morning street of Caldwell in October, horses at hitching posts, a woman sweeping her boardwalk, the smoke from the warehouse still rising in a thin gray thread against the cold blue sky. "I saved the land records," she said, "and the people who own that land, that is what I do." "It is what you do alone," he said, "every time." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "That must get heavy," he said. She looked at him sideways, and it was not the assessing look, it was something more exposed and more careful. "Yes," she said again, more quietly, "it does." He did not say anything else for a while. They drank their coffee in the morning cold, and the town of Caldwell woke up around them, and Jonas Ford thought about a woman who had been carrying the weight of 9 years of solitary, dangerous, righteous work. And he thought about how she had thrown a lantern through a warehouse door in the dark with a precision that had saved his life, and how she had drawn up a map of human positions using surveyor's compass bearings, and how she had looked at Edgar Harmon in the moment before Jonas came through the trapdoor with the steady courage of someone who had been in dangerous situations, enough times that fear had become simply another variable to account for. He thought about all of that. And he thought about the look on her face when she had told him that she would carry the deaths of Chester Rowe and Frank Aldis for the rest of her life. And he thought about the slight, careful softness that had come into her expression in the saloon lamplight. And he made a decision that surprised him by its completeness, because Jonas Ford was not a man who made significant decisions quickly, and yet this one arrived fully formed. He wanted to know Matilda Hurst. He wanted to know everything about her. He wanted to be the person beside whom she did not have to carry the weight alone. But he was also a man who understood timing, and the morning of October the 14th, with 2 dead deputies and 7 men in his jail and a federal court process beginning, was not the moment for declarations of any kind. So he kept it inside, carefully, the way Matilda kept most things inside, and he simply sat beside her in the morning light and was glad that she was safe. The U.S. Marshals arrived from Wichita 2 days later, 3 of them, led by a deputy marshal named Holt who was professionally thorough and personally uncomfortable. Jonas suspected, with the reality that the case had been essentially solved before his arrival. He interviewed Jonas at length, and then he interviewed Matilda at greater length. And when he emerged from that interview, he sought out Jonas with an expression that Jonas could only describe as slightly stunned. "That woman," Holt said, "has documented evidence that will put Edgar Harmon and his brother Clyde away for 10 years minimum, and will void 6 fraudulent land titles and restore ownership to 15 separate homesteaders." She has been building this case for 7 months across 4 counties alone. I know, Jonas said. Does she work for anyone, the government, a land company? Herself, Jonas said. She works for herself. Holt shook his head slowly. That is remarkable. Yes, Jonas agreed, watching Matilda across the street where she was calmly directing a group of federal clerks in the organization of her documentary evidence with the efficiency of a general managing supply lines. It is. In the days following the Harmon gang's arrest, Caldwell settled back into its October rhythms, the cattle drives long finished for the season, the town contracting toward its quieter winter character. The hotel families went back to their rooms. Thomas Reed went back to his ranch, which was now genuinely his ranch again with the fraudulent title voided, and he shook Matilda's hand for nearly a full minute before he rode out, his eyes bright with something that was not quite tears but was close to them. The 2 dead deputies, Chester Rowe and Frank Aldis, were buried in Caldwell Cemetery on the morning of October 16th, and Jonas stood at both graves and felt the weight of leadership, the specific, permanent weight of having put men in positions where the information they lacked had gotten them killed. It was a weight that never fully lifted. He knew that. Matilda stood with the families at both services, quietly at the back. She had not been invited, but she came, because Jonas understood now that she felt responsible in the way that conscientious people always felt responsible for outcomes that their information might have prevented, even when the fault was not theirs. After the second service, he fell into step beside her as they walked back from the cemetery, and he said, "You could not have moved faster than you did." She kept walking for several steps before she said, "I could have come to you the night I confirmed it was Sims. That is a fact. And if Sims had gotten word to Harmon that you had moved, and Harmon had accelerated the timeline, and his men had come in the night instead of in the evening with less warning and more cover," she was quiet. "Sometimes there is no version that avoids all of the damage," he said. "The best version saves the most people. You saved 23 people and a town and 6,000 acres of land. That is the version that happened." She looked at him, and the expression on her face was complex, many-layered, the face of a person who had been offered something they were not sure how to receive. "You are trying to make me feel better," she said. "I am telling you the truth," he said. "The two things are not mutually exclusive." Something moved across her face, and then she looked away at the Kansas plains, flat and gold in the October light, stretching out to a horizon that was just the edge of the sky and nothing else, and she said quietly, "I have been doing this work for 9 years. No one has ever said that to me before." He let that sit for a moment, and then he said, "Have dinner with me tonight." She looked at him again, the assessing look, but different now, warmer and more uncertain. "Is that a professional request?" "No," he said. The warmth that crossed her face was the closest thing to unguarded joy he had seen from her, brief and real, and quickly composed back into her usual steadiness. "All right," she said. "Dinner." They had dinner at Mrs. Garrett's boarding house, which had a small dining room that Mrs. Garrett was pleased to set for 2 on the occasions that her boarders had guests. And she did so now with the particular enthusiasm of a woman who had watched Matilda Hurst live in her boarding house for 3 weeks without a single social engagement, and had decided privately that this was a situation in need of remedy. The dinner was simple, the honest cooking of the frontier, roasted beef and potatoes and bread from that morning's baking and canned peaches, that Mrs. Garrett produced from her cellar with a flourish that suggested she had been saving them for a special occasion. Jonas brought a bottle of decent wine from the general store, which had acquired a case of it from a trader passing through from Santa Fe, and which made no particular claims about its origin beyond the fact that it was grape-derived and not whiskey. They talked for 3 hours. Jonas learned that Matilda had grown up in Springfield, Illinois, the eldest of 4 children of a surveyor named Arthur Hurst and his wife Clara, who had been a schoolteacher. She had spent her childhood following her father across fields and creek beds and property lines, learning the transit and the chain, and the mathematics of boundary measurement before she had finished her basic schooling. She had attended the Illinois State Normal University for 2 years before her father's illness had required her to return home, and those 2 years had given her a formal grounding in mathematics and natural science that supplemented the practical knowledge she had accumulated in the field. Her father had died in 1873 when she was 19. The land fraud that had stolen his property had been perpetrated by a railroad company's subsidiary, and the legal battle to recover it had consumed every dollar of the family's remaining savings and had ultimately failed, because the railroad had better lawyers and a more pliant judge than justice required. Her mother and younger siblings had relocated to Chicago, where a maternal uncle provided modest support. Matilda had taken the surveying instruments, which the creditors had overlooked as tools rather than assets, and had gone west. Why west? Jonas asked. Because the land fraud was worse out here, she said simply. And the documentation was worse. And the people who owned the land were often recent homesteaders, families who had come out with everything they had and a land patent from the government, and they did not have the knowledge to protect themselves when someone with fraudulent surveys tried to displace them. I understood exactly what was happening to them because it had happened to my father. I had the skills to fight it, and I had nothing to keep me in Illinois, so I came west and I started fighting. Jonas looked at her across the table, the wine between them and the lamplight warm on her face, and he said, "That is one of the bravest things I have ever heard." She looked slightly uncomfortable with the word brave, as though she had not particularly considered herself that way. "It was a practical decision," she said. "I had skills that were needed, that is all. Most people with needed skills find ways to apply them that do not require riding alone into corrupt land operations run by armed gangs," Jonas pointed out. She tilted her head, acknowledging this. "I do not recommend it as a life strategy for most people," she said. He smiled, and she smiled back, and it was the first time he had seen her smile fully, without reservation, and the effect on his carefully maintained composure was significant enough that he had to make a deliberate effort to maintain his contribution to the conversation. He told her about himself in return, which was something he was less accustomed to doing. He had grown up in Ohio, the son of a civil engineer father and a mother who had been a nurse during the war, and he had come west at 22 with a friend who had wanted to try cattle ranching. The friend had gone back to Ohio after 18 months. Jonas had stayed, working cattle drives for 2 seasons before being offered a deputy position in Wichita, and from there a sheriff's appointment in Caldwell at 26. He was 31 years old. He had been sheriff for 4 years. He had not had what could be described as a personal life in most of that time, because the job consumed what personal life tried to exist, and because the available social structures of a cattle trail town were not particularly suited to the kind of meaningful connection he was apparently inclined to want. He did not say all of this directly. He said enough that she could read the shape of it, because she was very good at reading shapes. "You are lonely," she said, not with pity but with the matter-of-fact quality of someone identifying a variable in a calculation. "I have been," he said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "So have I," she said, "but I had convinced myself that it was the cost of the work and that the work was more important than the cost." "It is important," he said, "and you should not have to stop doing it." She looked at him with an expression that was very careful and very open at the same time, the expression of someone navigating between 2 things they wanted equally and had not previously thought they could have simultaneously. "No," she said quietly. "I should not." He walked her to the boarding house door when the evening ended, and they stood on the boarding house porch in the October cold with the stars hard and brilliant above the Kansas plains, and he said, "I would like to see you tomorrow." "I have work tomorrow," she said. "I am meeting with the federal clerk about the certified survey copies." "I know," he said. "I am going to be in the same building for the same reason. We could walk there together." The warmth in her expression was unmistakable and unguarded in the cold air and the starlight, and she said, "Yes, we could do that." He tipped his hat. She went inside. He walked back across Caldwell's quiet main street in the starlight, and he was smiling in a way that the empty street could not embarrass him for, and he felt the kind of lightness that a man feels when something significant and right has begun. They walked to the federal clerk's office together the next morning, and the morning after that they walked back together too. And on the third morning, Matilda brought 2 cups of coffee from Mrs. Garrett's kitchen, and they stood on the boarding house porch before beginning the walk, and the coffee was very good, and the conversation was even better. She stayed in Caldwell for the federal proceedings, which took 3 weeks to reach a preliminary determination that the Harmon land fraud case had sufficient documentation to proceed to full trial. During those 3 weeks, Jonas discovered the full depth of Matilda Hurst, the layers beneath the professional precision and the operational calm, the woman who read everything she could get her hands on and had strong opinions about territorial water law and could calculate surveying problems in her head faster than most men could do them on paper, the woman who had a dry, understated humor that appeared in unexpected moments and was more genuinely funny than most deliberate humor he had encountered, the woman who was fiercely protective of people she considered vulnerable, particularly homesteaders and their children, and who became quietly ferocious when she felt that protection was being inadequately provided by the systems that were supposed to provide it. He also discovered that she was afraid of being needed by someone and then leaving them, because she had spent 9 years being someone who left, who moved from county to county and case to case, who set down roots for the specific duration of a fraud investigation and then pulled them up again. She was afraid, he understood, that she did not know how to stay. He understood this because he had also been afraid, for different reasons, of the same thing. On the 21st day of October, sitting on the boarding house porch after a long day at the federal proceedings, with the first real cold of the approaching Kansas winter in the air and the sky going orange behind the flat horizon, he told her this. "I think you are afraid that staying means giving something up," he said, "but I think the work does not have to stop for the person to stay." She looked at him. "What are you saying, Jonas?" He had been thinking about how to say it for several days, and he had not found a version that was sufficiently precise, which was ironic given that he was speaking to a woman whose professional specialty was precision, so he settled for directness in the absence of elegance. "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you," he said, "and I am saying that the last thing in the world I want is to be the reason you stop doing work that matters. But I would like very much to be the person who is here when you come back from doing it, and who rides out with you when you need someone to watch your back, and who makes coffee on the mornings when you are mapping fraudulent land surveys and need something warm to start with." She was very still for a long moment. The orange light from the horizon moved across her face, and her dark eyes were wide and entirely unguarded in a way he had never seen from her before. "You are not asking me to stop," she said. "I am asking the opposite," he said. She looked at the horizon for a moment, and then she looked back at him and she said, "I have never been in love before. I did not know what it felt like, but I think I have been in it for approximately 2 weeks, and I did not quite recognize it because I had no reference point." He felt warmth spread through his chest. "And now?" he asked. "And now I recognize it," she said, "and I am terrified and also very glad." He reached across the distance between them and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the boarding house porch in the October cold with the Kansas plains going dark around them, and something between them that had been built on the strangest possible foundation, a lantern thrown through a warehouse door in the middle of an ambush. And that foundation was stronger for its peculiar origin, because it had been built on the clearest possible revelation of who each of them truly was. They were married in Caldwell on the 12th of November, 1882, a month to the day after the ambush that had brought them to each other in the way that extreme circumstances have always had of revealing essential character. The ceremony was performed by Caldwell's circuit minister, a practical and good-humored man named Reverend Chalk, who conducted the ceremony with a brevity that Jonas appreciated, and that Matilda appreciated even more. Mrs. Garrett cried, which was somehow entirely expected and deeply touching, and Thomas Reed rode back into Caldwell for the occasion and brought a ham from his now legally confirmed ranch, and shook Jonas's hand even longer than he had shaken Matilda's, which was saying something. The federal trial of Edgar Harmon and the core members of his gang proceeded in Wichita in the spring of 1883, and Matilda served as the primary expert witness on the survey documentation, appearing before the court with a precision and authority that caused the Harmon defense attorneys considerable visible distress, and caused Deputy Marshal Holt to say afterward that she was the most effective witness he had seen in 12 years of federal law work. Edgar Harmon received 10 years in the federal penitentiary. His brother Clyde, who had been apprehended separately in Medicine Lodge in February, received 8 years. The fraudulent land titles were voided. The homesteaders got their land back. Jonas attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with the solid, quiet presence of a man who understood that this was Matilda's victory to take, who wanted to witness it and not to occupy it. On the last day, when the verdict was read and the courtroom settled into the particular silence that follows the completion of a long-running injustice, Matilda turned from the witness area and found him in the gallery, and the look that passed between them was the kind that requires no translation in any language. They stayed in Caldwell. It had been the question that Matilda had expected to wrestle with, the question of whether a woman who had been moving for 9 years could learn to be in a place, and the answer had arrived more naturally than she had anticipated. Caldwell had become familiar to her in the particular way that places become familiar when they contain people you love, when the main street and the boarding house porch and the sheriff's office with its trapdoor in the back storeroom and the creek behind the livery stable are all mapped onto memory, not just as geography, but as the landscape of a life. She continued her work. This had been Jonas's insistence from the beginning, and she had discovered in the first year of their marriage that he had meant it absolutely and without reservation. When a homesteader in the next county sent word through the mail about a boundary dispute that had the characteristics of the fraudulent survey fraud she had seen before, Jonas made sure her instruments were loaded on the wagon, made sure she had provisions and a map, and rode with her for the first 2 days of the journey until his duties required him to turn back. She worked 3 cases in the year following the Harmon trial, all of them successful, all of them resulting in voided fraudulent titles and restored ownership. The word about her work spread in the way that professional reputation spread on the frontier, person to person and letter to letter, and homesteaders began reaching out to her before the fraud had fully advanced, which was significantly more efficient than arriving after the damage was done. Jonas became something new to her, which was the person who held the geography steady while she moved through it. He was the fixed point in the survey, the reliable mark against which everything else could be measured. She had not known she needed a fixed point until she had one, and having one changed the quality of all the moving in ways she found difficult to articulate but which were completely real. In the spring of 1884, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Jonas on a Sunday morning, on the porch of the small house they had purchased at the edge of Caldwell, a house with a proper kitchen, and a room that Matilda had converted into a survey office, with her instruments mounted precisely on their stands, and her field notebooks arranged in the chronological order of their cases on the shelves. Jonas sat down on the porch step, with an expression that Matilda thought she would spend a long time being glad she had witnessed, because it was the expression of a man for whom something completely unexpected and entirely wonderful had just arrived, and it did not have a complicated element in it. They had a boy, born in December of 1884, in the hard Kansas winter with the plains white, and still outside the window and Mrs. Garrett in the kitchen making a continuous supply of hot broth, because it was the only thing she could think to do that helped. They named him Arthur, for Matilda's father, and Jonas held him in the lamplight of the bedroom with the careful, slightly overwhelmed reverence of a man handling the most important thing he had ever held. And Matilda looked at him holding Arthur and felt something settle in her chest that was permanent and complete. Arthur grew, in the way that children on the Kansas plains grew, with the whole flat world available to him and two parents who were deeply invested in his development and deeply in love with each other, which gave him a foundation that many frontier children did not have. He was a curious child, as might have been expected given his parentage, and he took to his mother's instruments with an enthusiasm that delighted her and did not particularly surprise Jonas. By the time Arthur was 3, Matilda was teaching him the names of the transits parts the way her own father had taught her, seated on the floor of the survey office with the afternoon light coming through the window and the instruments gleaming on their stands. And Jonas would pause in the doorway watching them and feel the particular satisfaction of a man who had built something that was working exactly as it was supposed to. Caldwell changed through the mid-1880s, as the cattle drives began their slow decline with the spread of barbed wire fencing across the open ranges. The Kishom Trail era was ending. The town was adapting, diversifying from its cattle trade economy into farming and small commerce, and the steady settlement that came after the wild years. Jonas's job changed with the town, becoming less about immediate physical danger and more about the adjudication of property disputes and the maintenance of civil order in a community finding its peacetime character. He was good at this too. He had always been good at the law's underlying purpose, which was the protection of order and the fair treatment of people within that order, and the peacetime version of the job called on a different set of skills than the cattle drive version, but was not less meaningful. Matilda's work evolved as well. The worst of the frontier land fraud era was beginning to resolve as federal oversight improved, and as the homestead grant system was better administered, but the expertise she had accumulated across 12 years of field survey work was valuable in a different way now. She began working with the county recorder's office as an official consultant, reviewing survey filings before they were recorded rather than after, which was far more efficient than her previous method of arriving after the damage was done, and trying to document it backward into rectification. This kept her closer to home, which was a change she embraced without the ambivalence she might have expected to feel. She was 35 years old in 1889, when the second pregnancy made itself known, and she was established enough in her work and in herself that the disruption to her schedule was something to be managed rather than resisted. Their second son arrived in the spring of 1890, a robust, loud child who announced himself to the entire neighborhood of Caldwell at the moment of his birth, and continued to be generously vocal about his preferences for the duration of his infancy. They named him James, for Jonas's father, and Arthur, 5 years old and very serious about his status as eldest brother, examined James with the careful interest of a small surveyor measuring an unfamiliar feature, and pronounced him acceptable. Jonas watched this examination with the expression he had developed over the years of fatherhood, which was the expression of a man who was slightly overwhelmed by how much happiness was possible, and who was managing this overwhelming by maintaining an extremely straight face. Matilda caught him at it and said, from the bed where she was recovering from the delivery, "You can smile, Jonas. The baby will not think less of you." He smiled, and it was the complete, uncomplicated smile of a man who had more than he had ever thought to ask for, and Matilda smiled back from the pillows with the open warmth that 9 years of marriage had taught her to stop containing, and baby James continued to exercise his considerable voice, and Arthur stood on his tiptoes to look into the cradle with solemn scientific interest. And outside the window of the small house at the edge of Caldwell, The Kansas plains stretched to the horizon in the green of the prairie spring. The Harmon case had become, over the years, a touchstone story in Caldwell's local history, told in the way that frontier communities told stories of their formative moments, with embellishment and compression and the narrative inevitability of hindsight. The version that circulated most widely was essentially accurate in its facts, which was unusual for frontier legend, because the people who had been present for it were still present, and were the kind of people who had professional objections to inaccurate documentation. Jonas occasionally heard himself described in these tellings as having taken down the whole Harmon gang single-handed, which required correction. And he made that correction every time with the consistent point that the Sheriff of Caldwell in the fall of 1882 had been saved from an impossible situation by the strategic intelligence and physical precision of Matilda Hurst, who was now Matilda Ford, who was now measuring survey boundaries in the county recorder's office 2 days a week, and that anyone who wanted to know the full account should ask her directly. Matilda's version of the story, when she told it, was characteristically precise about the operational details and characteristically economical about the romantic outcome, which she described as a consequence of events, in a tone that made Jonas smile every time he heard it, because he knew exactly what the full consequence had cost her to risk, and how completely she did not regret it. The Edgar Harmon case had one final development. In the spring of 1892, when Edgar Harmon's sentence was completed and he was released from the federal penitentiary. There was a brief period of concern in Caldwell, because the nature of the case had given Jonas and Matilda a certain profile as the people who had documented and prosecuted it, and there were questions about whether Harmon would consider revenge. Harmon did not consider revenge. He was a man who had spent 10 years in prison thinking about the series of decisions that had brought him there, and the conclusion he had reached, which he communicated in a brief, terse letter to the Caldwell Sheriff's office, was that the most efficient outcome was to go back to Missouri, where he had family, and to stay there. Jonas read the letter twice and then handed it to Matilda, who read it once and said, "He has calculated that the cost of revenge exceeds the benefit. He is not a sentimental man." "Are you satisfied with that?" Jonas asked. She thought about it genuinely, which was one of the things he loved most about her, that she engaged even simple questions with real consideration. "Yes," she said finally. "Justice was the goal. It was achieved. His future choices are his own to make." She handed the letter back to him and returned to the transit she had been calibrating on the survey office table, and Jonas watched her work for a moment. The focused, economical precision of her hands on the instrument's adjustment screws, the angle of her head over the eyepiece, the small, satisfied sound she made when the calibration settled exactly where it needed to be. He had watched her calibrate that instrument hundreds of times. It still held his complete attention. In the fall of 1892, 10 years after the ambush that had begun everything, Caldwell held a small civic ceremony to mark the dedication of a new county building that would house the recorder's office and the expanded county administration. The building's dedication included brief remarks from various civic figures, and the town council had asked Jonas to say a few words in his capacity as sheriff, which he did with the economy of a man who had never been fond of speech-making, but understood its necessary place in civic life. He spoke about the growth of the county, the transition from the cattle drive era to the farming settlement era, the improvements in land administration that had reduced the kind of fraud that had plagued the earlier years. He spoke about the deputies who had died in service of the county's safety, Chester Rowe and Frank Aldis, whose names were on a small plaque in the lobby of the new building. He spoke about the value of accurate documentation and transparent record-keeping, and what these things meant for the safety of the people who had come to this county with a land patent and the belief that what was recorded was what was real. And then he said, which was not in his prepared remarks and which surprised the town council and did not surprise Matilda, who had been watching him from the small audience with the look of someone who knows exactly what is coming. Most of what this county has built toward fair and accurate land administration in the past 10 years is owed to the work of one person, who has spent her professional life fighting for the people who cannot fight that particular fight alone. She is also the person who, in October of 1882, devised a diversion so precisely calibrated that it saved this county from a land fraud operation that had already eliminated 2 of its lawmen and had its sheriff pinned down with 4 bullets and no options. I owe her my life. This county owes her considerably more than that. Her name is Matilda Ford, and I am very proud that she is my wife. The applause was genuine and warm and slightly delayed by the surprise of the last sentence, and Matilda, from the audience, looked at Jonas Ford with the expression of a woman who had spent 9 years alone and 10 years not alone, and who knew with complete certainty which version of her life was better. Not because the solitary years had lacked meaning, they had been full of meaning, but because meaning shared was a different order of thing than meaning accumulated in private. She stood up and accepted the applause with the composed dignity that was her natural register, and she caught Jonas's eye across the crowd, and the look between them was the kind that had been building for 10 years and had not diminished in complexity or depth with the accumulation of time, but had instead become more layered, more specific, more private in the way that a long and honest love becomes the most private language 2 people can share. That evening, with Arthur 8 years old and James 2 years old, and both of them eventually persuaded into their beds by the combined authority of their parents and the promise of a story from Jonas, who was a surprisingly good storyteller despite his general economy with words, Jonas and Matilda sat on the porch of their house in the autumn dark, and the Kansas night was enormous and starlit above them in the way that prairie nights are enormous, without the softening of trees or hills, just the full, unobstructed depth of the sky. Matilda said, "You surprised me today." "I meant to," Jonas said. She looked at the stars. "I did not know you were going to say that." "I know. I wanted it to be true in front of people. It is easy to say things in private. Saying them in public is a different kind of commitment." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "When I came to Caldwell in the fall of 1882, I thought I was coming to document a land fraud case. I thought I would be here for 3 months and then move on to the next county." "I know," he said. "I had not planned for you," she said. "No," he agreed. "I imagine a survey of your initial plan did not include a stubborn sheriff with 4 bullets." She laughed quietly in the dark, and it was still the best sound he knew. "No," she said. "He was not on the original map." "But he is on all the subsequent ones," Jonas said. She leaned into him, which was something she had come to do over 10 years of evenings, a gesture so habitual that it had become part of the architecture of their life together, as structural and essential as the survey instruments on their stands in the office. "He is," she said, "right in the center." He put his arm around her, and they sat in the autumn night while the stars turned slowly overhead in their ancient, reliable arcs. And inside the house, Arthur and James were sleeping, and the county recorder's office had Matilda's consultation schedule on its board for the coming week, and the sheriff's office had the morning's duty roster on Jonas's desk. And the Kansas plains stretched in every direction toward horizons that were clean and open, and full of the particular possibility that the frontier had always promised, the promise that the work you did here mattered, that the land was real, that the people on it were real, and that the things you built could last. They had built something that lasted. They both knew it. Not because it had been easy. The first year of marriage had included 3 significant arguments about workflow and privacy, and the correct approach to the calibration of a particular type of survey instrument that Jonas had an opinion about which Matilda had considered incorrect, and had demonstrated to be incorrect with a field test that still made him smile when he thought about it. Not because it had been uncomplicated, but because it had been built by 2 people who were genuinely matched, whose strengths were different but complementary, whose respect for each other was the foundation that everything else rested on. He had fallen in love with her because she was exceptional. She had fallen in love with him because he had recognized it and been glad of it rather than threatened by it. That was the simple truth of it, stripped of sentiment and left in its operational form, as clean as a survey measurement and as permanent. Arthur Ford grew up to be a surveyor. This surprised no one. He had his mother's precise analytical mind and his father's patience. And by the time he was 16, he was helping Matilda in the field with a competence that she assessed with the same rigorous objectivity she brought to everything and found to be genuine. He went to a technical college in Topeka in 1900, which Matilda prepared him for with the thoroughness of a woman who had always believed that formal education built on practical knowledge was the most powerful combination available. James Ford grew up to be a lawyer, which surprised everyone including himself. He had his father's directness and his mother's attention to the logic of systems, and a temperament that found adversarial argument genuinely interesting rather than draining. He read law in a Wichita office in the early years of the new century, in the period when Kansas was becoming something different from the frontier territory it had been, when the wild years were becoming history, and the history was becoming myth, and the actual work of the place was the steady, unspectacular business of civilization doing what civilizations do when they are not being dramatic. Jonas stayed Sheriff of Caldwell until 1898, when he was 47 years old, and the town council, with considerable ceremony, proposed retiring his position into a city marshal structure that was more appropriate to Caldwell's settled, peaceable current character. He accepted this with the equanimity of a man who had always understood that the job was a stewardship rather than an identity, and who had other things to do. What he did, in the years after the sheriff's position, was run the small ranch that he and Matilda had acquired east of town, a modest property with good creek water and winter hay, and enough cattle to be a real operation, without requiring more management than 2 people and occasional hired help could provide. He also rode out occasionally with Matilda on her county consulting work, carrying the equipment and reading the angles when she needed a second pair of eyes on the transit, doing with his body what she had once said she was doing with the survey, covering more ground because there were 2 of them. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. He had discovered, the first time he rode out with her on a proper field survey in the summer of 1883, that the work had a satisfaction to it that was entirely different from law enforcement, but was similarly rooted in accuracy and the protection of what was real and true. He had asked her to teach him the transit formally, and she had done so with the methodical patience of someone who had been taught by a very good teacher and knew exactly how to pass it on. He was never as good as she was. He did not have 9 years of practice from the age of 10, which was the foundation she had built on, and which no amount of adult application could entirely replicate. But he was good enough to be useful, and that was what he wanted to be. In the spring of 1900, with the new century arrived, and Kansas fully in its settled era, Matilda and Jonas stood together at the edge of a field east of Caldwell, where the survey markers she had placed in the accurate boundaries of a small homestead confirmed that the property was exactly where the land patent said it was, no more and no less, clean and true and properly recorded. She set the transit's level bubble and read the angle and wrote the number in her field notebook with the precise, economical hand she had developed over decades, and Jonas stood beside her holding the survey rod at the back station and watching her work, and the morning sun came across the Kansas plains at a low, golden angle that lit the field in the particular light of spring, which is the light of beginning. She looked up from the notebook and found him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I like watching you work." She looked at him with the expression that had been building and refining itself for 18 years, from the composed assessment of a woman who had not yet understood what she was looking at, through all the gradual openings of trust and familiarity and love, to this, the face of a person who knew exactly what she was looking at and was entirely glad. "You have been watching me work for 18 years, she said. "Yes," he said. "I intend to continue." She closed the notebook and tucked it under her arm and looked at the field, the marked boundaries, the accurately measured truth of the property stretching in its correct and documented dimensions under the spring sky. "We should finish the south line before noon," she said, "or the light will be wrong for the angle." "Then let us finish the south line," he said. She picked up the transit and moved down the field with the purposeful stride of a woman who had work to do and knew exactly how to do it. And Jonas followed with the survey rod, and the Kansas morning opened around them, big and golden and mapped and real. And everything between them was accounted for, every boundary placed correctly, every measurement true, every line of their shared life documented not in a field notebook but in the reliable, irreducible record of what two people build when they build together, when neither one requires the other to be less than what they are, when the love that grows between them is as precise and as permanent as a surveyed line in good Kansas soil. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of what they had ever needed, standing in a field in the morning with the work still to be done and the rest of their lives still to be lived together, on ground that was solid and mapped and wholly, undeniably theirs.